The first laugh was a bark, short and sharp like a dog's. It came from a man with a face like cured leather, his eyes small and mean in the folds of sun-baked skin. Jedediah Thorne did not smile. He bared his teeth. He held a ledger in one hand, its cover stained and curled at the edges, and slapped it against his palm. The sound was a flat, ugly crack in the heavy silence of the plains. Elara stood on the porch of the home she had shared with Thomas for 20 years. The wood was silvered with age, worn smooth by their footsteps. Now, only hers remained. She was a large woman, built of the same sturdy, steadfast material as the land itself. Her grief was a heavy cloak, but her spine was a rod of iron beneath it. Thorne and his 3 sons stood in the dust of her yard, their horses shifting restlessly behind them. They had ridden in not an hour past, smelling of whiskey and entitlement. They had dismounted without invitation, their boots churning the earth Thomas had so carefully tended. The second laugh was a wheezing snicker from the youngest son, a boy barely a man, with a cruel twist to his lips that mimicked his father's. He nudged his brother. "Look at her. Barely fits the doorway." The words were meant to be a whisper, but they carried in the still air, landing like stones. Elara did not flinch. Her gaze remained fixed on the elder Thorne. Her hands were clasped at her waist, still. Only the faintest tremor in her fingers betrayed the rage coiling in her belly. "The debt is a lie, Jedediah," she said. Her voice was low and even, a rumble of distant thunder. "Thomas kept his own books. He owed you nothing." Thorne grunted, a sound of contemptuous amusement. "Thomas is gone. His books are just paper and ink. Mine," he slapped the ledger again. "Mine is the one that matters. It says this farm, this house, this land. It's all mine now. Payment for his foolishness." The other 2 sons, twins with vacant, brutal faces, joined the laughter. It was a chorus of derision, a sound designed to break a person down, to sand them away until nothing was left but dust. They saw a fat widow, slow and helpless, swallowed by her mourning blacks, an easy target, an obstacle easily removed. They did not see the woman who had nursed a dying husband through a winter so cold the river froze solid. They did not see the woman who had set his broken leg with her own 2 hands after a fall. They did not see the fire banked behind her eyes. From the road, 100 yards away, a man stopped. He was leading a single tired horse, his belongings tied in a simple roll behind the saddle. He was lean and weathered, his face a mask of indifference, carved by wind and dust. He wore the silence of the wilderness like a second skin. He watched the 4 men in the yard and the solitary woman on the porch. He saw their posture, the arrogant tilt of their heads. He saw hers, the unbending line of her back. He had seen this play before, in other towns, with other actors. The script was always the same. Greed, cruelty, the strong preying on the weak. He leaned against a gnarled cottonwood, his hat pulled low, and simply watched. His name was Silas, and he was a man who understood the value of waiting. He knew that the loudest noises were often the most hollow, and that true danger rarely announced itself with laughter. Thorne tore a page from his ledger and spat on it before tossing it into the dust at Elara's feet. "You've got till sundown," he snarled, the last of his humor gone, replaced by a raw, impatient anger. "Be gone from my property, or my boys will haul you out. We'll burn what you leave behind." He turned, and his sons followed, mounting their horses with a jangle of spurs and creak of leather. They rode off in a cloud of their own making, their laughter trailing behind them, thinner and weaker, now against the vast, indifferent sky. Elara stood motionless until the sound of their hoofbeats faded completely, until the dust they had kicked up settled back onto the parched earth. She did not look at the crumpled paper lying by the steps. It was a prop in their theater of cruelty, and she would not grant it her attention. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western clouds in shades of bruised, purple and blood orange. Sundown. The word was a death sentence for the life she had known. She felt the weight of it, the crushing loneliness of the fight ahead. She turned to go back inside, to the echoing silence of her house, and that is when she saw him. The stranger. He was no longer by the road, but was walking toward her yard, his steps deliberate and unhurried. He was not a large man, but he moved with a solid, grounded economy that spoke of a quiet strength. Elara's hand instinctively went to the porch rail, her knuckles white. Another threat? A scavenger drawn by the scent of conflict? The man, Silas, stopped at the edge of her property, near the woodpile where Thomas's axe was still embedded in a half-split log. He gave her a single, steady look. It was not a look of pity, nor of aggression. It was a look of acknowledgement. He took off his hat, revealing a thick crop of dark hair silvered at the temples. Without a word, he worked the axe free from the log. He tested its weight, his calloused hands knowing. Then, with a smooth, powerful swing, he brought it down. The crack of splitting wood was a clean, honest sound. It was the opposite of Thorne's mocking laughter. It was a sound of work, of purpose. He did not look at her again. He simply set the first split log aside and positioned another. Swing, crack. The rhythm was steady, hypnotic. He was chopping her firewood. Elara watched him, her breath caught in her throat. He had not asked. He had not offered. He had simply seen a thing that needed doing and had done it. She stood there for a long time, listening to the rhythmic pulse of the axe, a sound that pushed back against the encroaching silence. The sun dipped lower, and the air grew cool. She turned and went inside. A few minutes later, she returned with a dipper of cool water from the well. She walked down the steps and across the yard, stopping a few feet from him. He paused, his axe resting on a log, and looked at her. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, she saw now, were a startlingly clear gray. She held out the dipper. He took it, his fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second. He drank the water in 3 long swallows, then handed it back. "Thank you," he said. His voice was rough, like stones in a dry creek bed. It was the first word he'd spoken. "He'll be back," Elara said, her own voice steady. "I know," Silas replied. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, picked up the axe, and went back to work. The sun led out across the horizon. Sundown came and went, and he was still there. Silas did not leave. When the wood was chopped and neatly stacked, enough for a week, he moved to the corral. The top rail of the fence was split, a casualty of a bolting horse, a month before Thomas had taken ill. Elara had not had the strength or the heart to fix it. Silas examined the break, ran his hand along the weathered grain of the wood. He found Thomas's tools in the small, tidy barn, exactly where they should be. He worked as the twilight deepened into a velvety, star-pricked darkness. Elara lit a lamp in the kitchen, its warm, yellow light a beacon in the gloom. She watched him from the window as she worked, her hands moving through familiar motions. She kneaded dough for bread, her movements sure and practiced. She cut thick slices of salt pork and dropped them into a hot skillet. The sizzle and pop were comforting, domestic sounds that felt like an act of defiance. She was not packing her belongings. She was making dinner. She was claiming her space, her home, with the simple, undeniable reality of a hot meal. When the food was ready, she filled 2 plates. She took one to the table and set it at Thomas's customary place. For a moment, her hand hovered over the empty chair, a fresh wave of grief threatening to crest. She pushed it down. This was not the time. She carried the second plate outside. Silas had nearly finished the repair, his silhouette dark against the last vestiges of daylight. He was using new pegs, carefully carved to fit the old holes. He was not just patching it. He was mending it, making it strong again. She stood quietly until he straightened up, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow with his forearm. "Supper's ready," she said. It wasn't a question or an invitation. It was a statement of fact. He looked from her face to the plate in her hands, then back again. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. He followed her inside, wiping his boots on the mat by the door with a surprising neatness. He set his hat on a peg and washed his hands in the basin, the splashing water loud in the quiet kitchen. They ate in silence. It was not an awkward silence. It was a silence born of necessity and a shared, unspoken understanding. There was no room for small talk. The air was too heavy with what was coming. Every sound was magnified. The scrape of a fork against a plate, the sigh of the wind outside, the crackle of the fire in the hearth she had lit. When they finished, Silas stood and took both empty plates to the wash basin. Elara started to protest, but he was already pumping water, his movements economical and efficient. He washed, she dried, a simple shared task. A partnership formed without a single word of negotiation. He was a mystery, a man who appeared from the dust and began rebuilding her life without permission. She noticed the deep, puckered scar that ran from his left temple into his hairline, a pale track against his tanned skin. She saw the way his eyes constantly scanned the windows and the door, even in the seeming safety of her kitchen. He was a man who had known violence. He was a man who expected it to return. He slept in the barn. She offered him the spare room, the one that had been meant for children they never had, but he refused with a slight shake of his head. He preferred the barn, he said, his back to the main doors facing the house. He was a sentinel, a silent guardian who had appointed himself to her cause. Lying in her bed that night, the house felt less empty than it had in weeks. The presence of the quiet stranger in the barn was a comfort, a thin but sturdy wall against the encroaching darkness. She did not know his name, nor he hers, but they were no longer strangers. They were allies. The morning broke clear and sharp. A deceptive peace lay over the land. Elara was up before the sun, stoking the fire, the familiar routine a comfort. She glanced out the window and saw Silas was already awake, testing the strength of the newly mended corral fence. He pushed against it with his full weight, and it held firm. A small, grim satisfaction settled in her. Let them come. This place would not be so easily broken. Around mid-morning, a lone rider appeared, a dark speck growing steadily larger against the pale prairie grass. It was not Thorne. It was the youngest son, the one with the cruel mouth. He rode with a swagger, his horse kicking up dust as he reined it to a halt in the yard. He had come to gloat, to intimidate. His eyes scanned the property, noting the stacked firewood, the mended fence. A flicker of surprise, then annoyance, crossed his face. He saw Silas, standing near the barn, his arms crossed over his chest. The boy's sneer returned. "You, drifter. Pa told the widow to be gone. You deaf or just stupid?" Silas didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched the boy on his horse, his gray eyes as flat and hard as river stones. His stillness was more unnerving than any threat could have been. The boy, whose name was Caleb, dismounted. He fancied himself a man. He thought his father's name was a shield that made him invincible. "I'm talking to you," he said, his voice rising. He took a step toward the house. "The woman's got to go." Silas moved then, not fast, but with an undeniable finality. He stepped directly into Caleb's path, a silent, unbreachable wall. He was shorter than the boy, but he seemed to take up more space, to have more weight. "Get out of my way, old man," Caleb spat, trying to shove past him. Silas's hand came up and caught Caleb's shoulder. It was not a strike, but a simple physical stop. His grip was like iron. Caleb's forward momentum ceased instantly. He grunted, surprised by the strength. He tried to wrench his shoulder free, but the man's fingers didn't budge. He could feel the power in that grip, a deep, coiled strength that had nothing to do with size and everything to do with something harder, something tempered by a life he couldn't imagine. Caleb looked from the unyielding hand on his shoulder to the man's face. There was nothing there. No anger, no fear, just a profound and terrifying emptiness. It was the look of a man for whom violence was not an event, but a tool. A deep, primal fear, something he hadn't felt since he was a small child, trickled into Caleb's gut. This was not some farmhand. This was something else entirely. Silas leaned in, his voice a low whisper that was more menacing than any shout. "Go. Tell your father. She is not leaving." He released his grip as suddenly as he had taken it. Caleb stumbled back a step, rubbing his shoulder. The bravado had vanished from his face, replaced by a pale, shaken look. He looked past Silas to the house, where Elara now stood on the porch, her arms also crossed, a mirror of the stranger's defiance. They looked like a fortress. He scrambled back onto his horse, fumbling with the reins. He didn't look back. He spurred the animal into a gallop, fleeing not from a fight, but from the promise of one he knew, instinctively, he could not win. Elara watched him go, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at Silas, who had already turned his attention to a loose hinge on the barn door, as if the confrontation had been a minor interruption, a fly to be swatted away. A small, unfamiliar feeling bloomed in her chest. It was not hope, not yet. It was something sturdier. It was resolve. The boy's retreat was not a victory. It was a declaration of war. They both knew it. The next time, Thorne would not send one son. He would come with all of them, and anyone else he could hire. The quiet peace of the morning was gone, replaced by the tense, humming silence of anticipation. The sky began to change. High, thin clouds scudded in from the west, veiling the sun and turning the light a flat, ominous gray. A storm was coming. Inside and out. They began to prepare. There was no discussion, no planning. They simply moved in concert, each anticipating the other's needs. Silas brought the tools inside. He began to reinforce the main door, hammering a thick wooden bar into place across its width. The blows of the hammer were rhythmic and determined. He checked the windows, ensuring the latches were firm, wedging small pieces of wood into the frames to prevent them from being rattled open. Elara moved through the house, her actions just as purposeful. She gathered blankets and the small medical kit she kept. She brought in buckets of fresh water from the well. She went to the heavy oak chest at the foot of her bed, the one she hadn't opened since Thomas's passing. The scent of cedar and old memories rose as she lifted the lid. Beneath Thomas's Sunday suit lay his rifle, a Winchester, carefully oiled and wrapped in cloth. Beside it was a Colt Peacemaker, its handle worn smooth. She ran her hand over the cool steel. Thomas had been a good shot, but a peaceful man. He had taught her to shoot years ago, when they first settled this wild land. A woman needs to know, he had said, not to seek trouble, but to end it. She had been a natural, her steady hand and calm demeanor making her a better shot than he was, a fact he'd taken quiet pride in. She carried the weapons into the kitchen and laid them on the table. She found the box of cartridges and began to methodically check each one, her movements precise and unhurried. As she worked, Silas entered from the back room. He was carrying a small canvas roll. He saw the guns on the table and gave a single, approving nod. He unrolled his own belongings on the floor. There was little there. A spare shirt, a whetstone, a block of soap, and a half-finished wooden carving of a bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. Elara's eyes were drawn to it. The detail was exquisite, each feather rendered with a patient, loving hand. It was a stark contrast to the hardened man who had made it. He saw her looking. For a moment his face softened, a flicker of some old, deep pain in his eyes. He picked it up, his thumb tracing the curve of a wing. "My daughter," he said, his voice thick. "She liked birds." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The past tense said everything. He gently placed the carving back in his roll and tied it shut. The moment of vulnerability was over. He picked up the rifle from the table, checking the action with an expert's familiarity. "He will come at dusk," Silas stated. "He'll use the fading light." Elara looked out the window. The clouds were lower now, the color of slate. The wind was beginning to rise, rattling the window panes. "Let him come," she said, her voice a low, steady flame. The storm was about to break. The last of the daylight was choked out by the bruised belly of the clouds. The wind moaned around the corners of the house, a mournful, keening sound. Inside, the only light came from a single lantern on the kitchen table, casting long dancing shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the smell of lamp oil, old wood, and the metallic tang of the guns that lay between them. Silas sat at one end of the table, the Winchester resting across his knees. He was cleaning the barrel with a small cloth, his movements methodical and calming. Elara sat opposite him, the Colt revolver on the table before her. Her hands rested in her lap, perfectly still. The silence stretched, filled only by the rising voice of the wind and the ticking of the mantel clock, each second a hammer blow counting down to a moment of dreadful certainty. "He was a good man, my Thomas," Elara said, her voice quiet but clear over the wind. She was not looking at Silas, but at the fire dancing in the hearth. Not a fighter, a builder. He believed in the goodness of people. He believed a man's word was his bond. She finally turned her gaze to Silas. Thorne was his partner once. In a land deal, years ago, Thomas put up the money. Thorne put up the promises. The deal went sour. Thomas lost everything, but he refused to believe Thorne had cheated him. He called it bad luck. He spent the last 10 years paying off a debt that was never real. She shook her head, a small, bitter movement. He died thinking Jedediah Thorne was his friend. Silas stopped his work. He looked at her, his gray eyes holding a deep, weary empathy. He had heard this story 100 times in 100 different places. The names changed, but the greed was always the same. "Men like Thorne," he said, his voice a low rasp. "They don't have friends. They have tools. When a tool breaks, they throw it away." He paused, his gaze dropping to the scar on his own hand. "My wife, my Anna," she thought the same. "We had a small ranch up in the high country. Good water, good grass. A man from a big cattle syndicate wanted it. Made an offer. I refused. He came back with lawyers, with forged papers. Said we were squatters on his land." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, a recitation of facts carved into his memory. "I fought him, in the courts. But his pockets were deeper. The judge was his. We lost. They gave us a week to leave." He fell silent. The wind howled, rattling the door in its new brace. "We didn't leave," he said, the words barely audible. "They came at night, with fire." He said nothing more. He didn't have to. The empty space he left in the story was filled with smoke and screams, and the ghost of a little girl who liked birds. Elara felt a profound and terrible connection to this broken man. They were two sides of the same coin, survivors of the same grasping, relentless evil. They were strangers, but their wounds came from the same source. A sudden, violent gust of wind slammed against the house, and the first drops of rain began to spatter against the window panes. A jagged fork of lightning lit up the yard for a split second, revealing nothing but swaying trees and churning mud. Silas stood up, picking up the rifle. "It's time," he said. He moved to the window beside the door, peering out into the maelstrom. Elara rose and picked up the Colt. The heavy, balanced weight of it felt right in her hand. It felt like an extension of her own will. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overlaid with something else now. A cold, hard certainty. This was her home. She would not be burned out of it. The rain came down in sheets, a solid wall of water that blurred the world into a churning chaos of gray and black. The wind shrieked, tearing at the roof shingles. It was a wild, violent night, a perfect cloak for wild, violent men. Elara stood by the kitchen window, the Colt held loosely at her side. Silas was a shadow near the front door, the long barrel of the Winchester pointing toward the floor. They waited. The house groaned under the assault of the storm, but it held. It was a good house. Thomas had built it to last. For a long time, the only sounds were from the weather. Then, through a lull in the wind, came a different sound, a splintering crash from the direction of the barn. "They're here," Silas said, his voice calm. He didn't need to raise it. In the tense confines of the small house, a whisper would have been a shout. Elara's heart leaped into her throat, a frantic bird beating against her ribs. She gripped the gun tighter, the checkered handle biting into her palm. She took a deep, steadying breath, the way Thomas had taught her. She could hear them now, shouting to each other over the storm, their voices indistinct but full of a brutish confidence. They were smashing the corral, the tool shed senseless, petty acts of destruction to terrorize, to announce their power. Another crash, this one closer, the front gate. Silas raised the rifle slightly. "Stay away from the windows," he ordered. Elara moved back, her body flattened against the interior wall, her eyes still fixed on the murky glass. She saw a flicker of movement, a dark shape darting through the deluge. Then another. They were moving toward the house, using the storm as cover. A loud bang echoed from the back of the house, followed by the tinkle of broken glass, the small pantry window. "They're testing," Silas said. "Trying to draw our fire." He remained perfectly still, a study in patience. Elara understood. They had few bullets. Every shot had to count. The waiting was the hardest part. The sounds from outside were a torment. The scrape of something against the wood siding, a muffled curse, the thud of a heavy boot against the back door. Her home was being violated, probed, tested for weakness. The rage that had been simmering within her began to burn hotter, burning away the edges of her fear. This was not just wood and nails. This was her life, her memories, the last piece of Thomas left in the world. She walked to the fireplace and took the heavy iron poker from its stand. She returned to her position, the Colt in her right hand, the poker in her left. A sudden, tremendous blow struck the front door, making the whole frame shudder. The bar Silas had installed groaned, but held. "Widow." It was Thorne's voice, a raw bellow that cut through the storm. "You had your chance. We're coming in. Any harm comes to my boys, and we'll burn you out like a rat." Another blow, heavier this time. A crack appeared in the thick wood of the door. They were using a log as a battering ram. Silas raised the rifle to his shoulder, his cheek pressed against the stock. He sighted down the barrel, not at the door, but at the wall beside it. He was waiting for them to break through. He was giving them the illusion of a clear path. Elara raised the Colt, her arm steady, her aim pointed at the center of the doorway. Her breathing was even. Her mind was clear. The house, her fortress, was about to be breached. A deafening crack echoed through the house as the front door splintered inwards, torn from its hinges. The heavy wooden bar Silas had installed snapped in two, the pieces flying across the room. For a heart-stopping second, the doorway was a black aping maw filled with rain and roaring wind. Then the first of Thorne's men lunged through, a big, bearded man brandishing an axe. He was silhouetted against the stormy darkness, a figure of pure menace. He took one step into the room, and the Winchester roared. The sound was immense, a physical blow that shook the very air. The man was thrown backwards, as if struck by an invisible fist, his axe clattering to the floor. He landed in the mud outside and did not move. Before the echo of the first shot had faded, Silas worked the rifle's lever, the metallic shik-shik, a sound of cold mechanical purpose. Another man, one of the twins, tried to follow, a pistol in his hand. He hesitated at the sight of his fallen comrade. It was a fatal pause. The Winchester barked again. The second man crumpled in the doorway, blocking it. The shouts from outside turned from triumphant to enraged. "He's in there! Get him!" Thorne screamed. Silas didn't wait. He moved away from the door, melting into the deeper shadows of the room. He knew they would concentrate their fire on his last position. A hail of pistol shots ripped through the doorway, splintering the wall where he had just been standing. Plaster dust filled the air. Elara remained pressed against the wall, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She could hear them scrambling at the back of the house now, the sounds of wood being pried apart. They were trying to flank them. "The back," she said, her voice tight. Silas was already moving. He darted across the kitchen, his movements swift and silent, a ghost in the flickering lamplight. He took up a position by the back door, just as it burst open. A third man, one of Thorne's hired hands, stumbled in, his eyes wide as he tried to adjust to the dim light. Silas didn't fire. He swung the rifle like a club, the heavy stock connecting with the man's jaw with a sickening crunch. The man collapsed without a sound. But another was right behind him. Caleb, the youngest son, his face a mask of terror and fury. He saw Silas and fired wildly, the shot going high and shattering a row of pickle jars on a shelf. The spray of glass and vinegar rained down. Silas lunged, grabbing the boy's gun hand and slamming it against the wall. The pistol clattered to the floor. They grappled in the narrow space, a desperate, grunting struggle. Caleb was younger and wiry, but Silas fought with a cold, brutal efficiency. He drove his knee into the boy's gut, then brought the heel of his hand up under his chin. Caleb's head snapped back, and he went limp. Silas let him fall. He was breathing heavily now, a thin line of blood trickling from a cut on his forehead where a piece of flying glass had caught him. He turned back towards the main room, just as Jedediah Thorne himself appeared in the front doorway, his face contorted with rage. He saw his second son's body blocking the entrance, and the fury in his eyes became something murderous. He leveled a large-caliber revolver. "You!" He bellowed at Silas. The gun boomed, the flash illuminating the whole chaotic scene. Silas cried out, a sharp intake of breath, and staggered back, clutching his side. The Winchester slipped from his grasp. He leaned heavily against the kitchen table, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. The fight had gone out of him. Jedediah Thorne stepped over the body of his own son, his boots smearing blood on the floorboards of Elara's home. His eyes were fixed on Silas, who was slumped against the table, his face pale in the lantern light. The last of Thorne's men, the remaining twin, pushed in behind him, a crowbar in his hand. He saw the wounded Silas, the chaos of the room, and a slow, cruel grin spread across his face. They had won. The stranger was down. The house was theirs. "Well, well," Thorne said, his voice a low, triumphant growl. He gestured with his pistol toward Silas. "Looks like your hired man wasn't as tough as he thought." He took a step further into the room, his arrogance restored. His gaze swept past the wounded man and finally fell upon Elara. She was standing near the hearth, partly obscured by shadow. He had almost forgotten about her. He saw her size, her disheveled state, the way she clutched the iron poker to her chest like a child with a doll. And he laughed. It was the same sound from that morning, a bark of derision and contempt. "Look at this, Will," he said to his son, hiding behind the fireplace. "Get out here, woman. I want you to watch while I finish this." Will, the son, chuckled and took a menacing step toward her. "Come on now, widow. The party's over." He saw the gun in her other hand, but it didn't register as a threat. It was just an object, a prop, a woman like her, a creature of the kitchen and the hearth. What could she possibly do with a man's weapon? He looked at his father and rolled his eyes, a shared moment of masculine condescension. "She thinks she's going to use that thing," he sneered. It was his last mistake. It was the last mistake any of them would ever make. Elara stepped out of the shadows and into the full light of the lantern. The woman they saw was not the one they had mocked. Her face was a mask of cold fury. Her eyes, which they had dismissed as dull, were burning with a righteous, terrifying light. The grief was still there, but it had been forged into something new, something hard and sharp. Her hand was steady. The barrel of the Colt Peacemaker did not waver. It was pointing directly at Will's chest. He stopped laughing. His sneer faltered. He saw the look in her eyes, and for the first time, he felt a sliver of fear. "Put that down," he said, his voice suddenly uncertain. Elara's lips pressed into a thin, hard line. She thought of Thomas's kindness, twisted into a weapon against him. She thought of their laughter, a sound that had tried to unmake her. She thought of the quiet man bleeding at her table, the only person who had stood with her. She cocked the hammer. The click was unnervingly loud in the sudden silence. Boom! The shot was thunderous. Will staggered back, a look of pure, dumb shock on his face. A dark circle appeared on his shirt. He looked down at it, then back at her, his mouth opening, but no sound coming out. He collapsed onto his side like a felled tree. Jedediah Thorne stared, his mind unable to process what he had just seen. He turned his head from his dead son to the woman with the smoking gun. The disbelief on his face curdled into pure, unadulterated rage. He raised his own revolver to fire at her. Boom! Elara's second shot caught him square in the chest. He grunted, a great exhalation of air and life, and stumbled backward, firing his own gun into the ceiling as he fell. He landed heavily across the threshold, half in the house, half out in the storm, his dead eyes staring up into the rain. Silence descended, broken only by the howl of the wind and the drip of water through the ruined roof. Elara stood in the center of her home, the Colt still held ready, smoke curling from its barrel. She had shot every man dead. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. It was a dense, ringing quiet, filled with the ghosts of the gunshots and the smell of cordite and blood. Elara stood for a long moment, the heavy Colt still raised, her knuckles white. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and a tremor in her hands. She lowered the gun, her arm feeling impossibly heavy. The room was a tableau of violent ruin. Smashed furniture, broken glass, the dark, still shapes of the men who had come to destroy her. Her home, her sanctuary, was now a tomb. She turned her attention to Silas. He was still leaning against the table, his hand pressed tight against the wound in his side. His face was slick with a mixture of rain and sweat, his breathing shallow. His eyes were open, and he was looking at her. There was no shock in his expression, no fear. There was only a quiet, profound respect. Her gaze fell to the Winchester on the floor by his feet, then back to the Colt in her hand. They had done this together. The thought was a small, solid anchor in the swirling chaos of her mind. She let the poker clatter to the floor and moved to him. "Let me see," she said, her voice rough. He let her gently pull his hand away. The bullet had gone in clean, high on his left side, just below the ribs. It was bleeding freely, staining his shirt a deep, dark crimson. It was bad, but perhaps not fatal. If she could stop the bleeding, if she could fight the fever that was sure to come, she became the woman she had always been, a caretaker, a mender. She tore a strip from a clean tablecloth and pressed it hard against the wound, "Hold this," she commanded. He obeyed, his own hand covering hers. His skin was cold. She worked quickly, her grief and rage channeled now into a desperate, focused purpose. She retrieved her medical kit, the same one she had used for Thomas. She found laudanum for the pain, carbolic acid to clean the wound, and thick pads of cotton and linen for bandages. She lit another lantern, pushing back the shadows. She tended to him on the kitchen floor, the storm still raging outside, a distant, muffled counterpoint to the intimate drama within the walls. She cleaned the wound as best she could, her touch surprisingly gentle. He bore the pain with a stoic silence, his jaw tight, his eyes squeezed shut. The only sound he made was a sharp hiss of breath when the carbolic stung the raw flesh. As she wrapped the clean bandage around his torso, he opened his eyes again. "Elara," he said. It was the first time he had spoken her name. "Silas," she replied, her own voice thick with emotion. It was all that needed to be said. Their bond, forged in silence and suspicion, was now sealed in blood and violence. When she was done, he was pale and weak, but the bleeding had slowed to a trickle. With her help, he managed to drink some water. She propped him up against the wall, covering him with a thick wool blanket. The immediate danger had passed. Now came the long, slow work of survival. She stood and looked at the bodies. At Jedediah Thorne, his arrogant face now slack in death. At his sons, their cruelty extinguished forever. There was no triumph in her, only a vast, aching sorrow. For Thomas. For Silas. For the peace that had been shattered. For the woman she had been forced to become. With a heavy sigh, she picked up a bucket. The storm was beginning to pass. Through the broken doorway, she could see the first faint hint of gray light on the eastern horizon. A new day was coming, and she and Silas were still here to see it. The grim work of cleaning up, of rebuilding, had begun. The days that followed were a blur of quiet shared labor. The storm passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air crisp and cool. The sun rose on a scene of devastation. Elara and a recovering Silas worked side by side, their movements synchronized by a deep, unspoken understanding. The first task was the grimmest. They dragged the bodies of Thorne and his men out of the house and loaded them onto their own wagon. Silas, his side tightly bound, moved stiffly, his face a mask of pain, but he refused to let Elara do the heavy work alone. She drove the wagon to the edge of her property, to the road leading back to the town she rarely visited, and left it there. A silent message to anyone who might have similar ideas. Let the town deal with its own dead. Then the rebuilding began. It was slow, arduous work. Silas, despite his injury, was a master craftsman. He showed her how to rebuild the doorframe, how to fit the new, thick planks of the door he fashioned from wood salvaged from the ruined barn. His hands, though slow, were sure. He taught her how to mix plaster to patch the bullet-riddled walls. She learned quickly, her own capable hands adapting to the new tasks. While he worked on the structure, she worked on the soul of the house. She scrubbed the bloodstains from the floorboards until her knuckles were raw. She swept up the last of the broken glass. She mended the torn curtains, her needle moving with a steady, rhythmic purpose. Each stitch was an act of reclamation. Each repaired object was a small victory against the chaos that had been unleashed upon them. They fell into a new routine. In the mornings, they worked. In the afternoons, as Silas rested his healing body, Elara tended to her garden, her hands in the rich soil, coaxing new life from the earth. In the evenings, they sat by the fire. The silence between them was different now. It was no longer the tense silence of strangers, but the comfortable, easy silence of family. One evening, Silas was sitting in his usual chair, a small block of pine in his hands. He was carving again, the slivers of wood falling onto the hearth. Elara watched him, the firelight catching the silver in his hair. He was no longer just a stranger, a protector. He was Silas, a man who had lost everything and had somehow found his way to her doorstep. He finished the carving and held it out to her. It was another bird, but this one was different from the one in his pack. This one was small and stout, with a determined look in its tiny carved eye. It looked less like it was flying and more like it was nesting. She took it from him, the wood smooth and warm in her palm. "For the mantle," he said gruffly, "to watch over the house." She stood and placed the small bird on the mantelpiece, right next to the clock. It looked as though it belonged there. It looked like a symbol of their new, fragile peace. As she turned back, she saw him watching her, a faint, unaccustomed smile touching the corners of his mouth. It transformed his weary face, erasing years of hardship for a brief moment. She felt an answering smile on her own lips. It felt foreign, a muscle long unused. The house was not the same. It bore the scars of the attack, just as they both bore their own. But it was whole again. It was safe. It was theirs. The seasons began to turn. The harshness of late autumn softened into the quiet sleep of winter. The fire in the hearth was never allowed to die out. And through the long, cold nights, the two survivors, a quiet man and a resilient woman, kept each other company, building a new life from the ashes of the old. Spring arrived like a whispered promise. The last of the snow melted away, and the land, which had slept under a blanket of white, began to breathe again. Tiny green shoots pushed their way through the dark, damp earth in Elara's garden. The creek, freed from its icy prison, babbled cheerfully. The world was waking up, and with it, something in the small, scarred farmhouse was waking up too. The fence Silas had built stood strong and true. The house, once a fortress under siege, was now simply a home, warm and welcoming. The scent of baking bread once again filled the kitchen, mingling with the clean smell of pine from Silas's endless carving. He was slower to heal than either of them had hoped, the wound in his side a constant nagging reminder of the violence they had endured. But his strength was returning, day by day. He spent his time on smaller tasks now, repairing tack, sharpening tools, weaving a new seat for a broken chair. His hands were always busy, always creating, always mending. Elara found that the crushing weight of her grief for Thomas had finally begun to lift. It was not gone, but it no longer defined her. It had become a part of her story, a deep and sorrowful note in a song that was now finding a new, more hopeful melody. She found herself laughing sometimes, a real unforced sound, usually at something Silas did, a dry, witty comment uttered so quietly she almost missed it, or the clumsy way he tried to help her shell peas, his large, calloused fingers sending them scattering across the floor. They were a peculiar family, born not of blood, but of shared trauma and mutual respect. They were two broken people who, in helping each other mend, had found a way to become whole again. He was the quiet strength that anchored her. She was the steady warmth that had brought him back to life. One sunny afternoon, Elara was on her knees in the garden, planting seeds. Silas sat on the porch steps, carving. He was working on a more complex piece now, a small, intricate horse with a flowing mane. He no longer carved only birds. He looked up from his work and watched her. He saw the strength in her back, the purpose in her hands as she worked the soil. He saw the way the sun lit up the stray wisps of hair that had escaped her bun. He remembered the woman on the porch who had faced down Thorne's men with nothing but her own indomitable will. He remembered the woman with the smoking gun and the eyes of cold fire. And he saw the woman before him now, a gentle gardener coaxing life from the dirt. They were the same woman. He had stopped here on his way to nowhere, a ghost of a man running from his past. He had intended to stay a night, to offer a moment's help, and then drift on. But the roots he had put down in this place, mending its fences and its broken heart, had somehow taken hold in his own barren soul. This place was home. So here ends our story, in the quiet peace of a spring afternoon. It began with the ugly sound of laughter and ended in the gentle rhythm of a life being rebuilt. It is a story of how the world often mistakes stillness for weakness and sighs for slowness. It is a tale of how the most formidable strength is often found in the people society has already dismissed. They saw a grieving widow, an obstacle to be swept aside. They failed to see the survivor, the protector, the heart of the home. They came with fire and fury to take a piece of land, never understanding that what they were truly trying to conquer was a spirit that could not be broken. Before you go, tell me this. When you look upon the quiet strength of those the world has overlooked, what is it that you truly see?